Thank you, Sakul. It's always a special moment to speak when Dr. Shashi Tharoor is hearing. It's been 2 years, and we grew up in his shadow as Stephanians. I was in the batch of 1998. There are a few more Stephanians in the audience, one of whom is going to also be in the panel shortly. But it's always, as a senior figure, someone who excelled in the international arena. I think for us to have him, I think he's in many ways the icing on the cake of all the efforts that have gone into making this book over the last 1.5 years. Let me just take you back a little bit to why I wrote this and what the thought process was when I was conceiving this. I was a columnist for the Financial Express, where my dear friend Dheeraj Nair was the editor at the time. And he was suggesting that I should move into writing on political economy. I hadn't done that before. In fact, my early works during my PhD just after were mostly on international security, which is war and peace and military and strategic issues. I hadn't thought about the economy and its link to state policies as well as conflicts in a very systematic and organized manner before. But the advantage was, my father who was here and who's been a major inspiration, told me way back when I was at the London School of Economics that trade and investment are going to matter increasingly in the era of globalization, and that you must do some academic coursework on this. So I was lucky to do a course on the politics of trade, and that in many ways I recollected as I was building this book in the wake of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the crash on Wall Street. And then somebody said, oh, it's interesting, you're an Indian author and you're writing about the global economic crisis. I thought India was not even affected. So that was, again, a trigger, a thought in me about what do you mean by systems? Because we were used to thinking about the system in academia of international relations in terms of the interstate system. We had never accounted for the rise of multinational corporations and their enormous influence and power over world affairs. And there it was, the crash of Lehman Brothers, 9/15, as we now remember, shattering a lot of these myths about what is strategy in the 21st century. Can we associate strategy only with states and not with giant corporations? What is Goldman Sachs? As described by some critics after the crash, it was supposed to have been a vampire squid that was sucking up all the capital that was available in given space and deploying it with great effect for more accumulation, and in many ways suborning governments and states. So I said, the era of state supremacy is gone. We know that from political economy, and increasingly we need to look at the role of private actors. Therefore, the crisis came as a sudden bolt from the blue for me, because I said, I need to write something about this shift in guard, or change of the baton from states to non-state actors, especially the private sector. And from there emerged the whole concept of the book. I began to follow it regularly, and you will see from the book, in the book, that it has reproduced some of my newspaper columns of those days from 2008 onwards, where I'm tracking week by week with the help of amazing editors at the Financial Express and later with the Economic Times. I'm tracking all the major developments related to the crisis, its after effects, and the continuing reverberations of it to this day. In fact, last week, my latest column is on JP Morgan settlement of $14 billion. So as an Indian author, I never felt that I needed to justify the fact that the crash happened somewhere in Wall Street, therefore I have no locus standi. Rather, what I was trying to say was, everyone has a stake in this, and that's why it's a global crisis. And therefore systems. It's a global economy, and systemic thinking was necessary. So I tried to piece this together in a way. You would have seen journalistic accounts of the crisis since 2008. You would have seen economists also writing about it. And I've drawn upon a lot of these sources. But then I said a political scientist needs to make an intervention here. So without qualms, I got into the whole notion of society, economy, and polity, and how these three are interconnected, and how the economy needed to have been embedded in society, but had been in many ways torn asunder by the financial oligarchs and their allies across the world. So it was fashionable in many ways to bash bankers after the crash, and I also shared much of the animus that I thought it was very, very unfair and unjust, the whole bailouts and austerity, and you'll see that in the book. There's a bit of an anger in the tone in what I've been writing. That's because I felt like, the proverbial person on the street had been shortchanged by established interests. And then what was the role of the state? As a political scientist, I had to come in there. And therefore, you'll see one of the chapters about the state of the state, as it's called, and how it has increasingly shifted away from the Westphalian model of a state being sovereign and in total control of economic processes to one where it is sometimes at the mercy of investors. So I began to argue that the investors and the people are actually, there's a clash of interest between the two, and the state has not been able to mediate this well enough. So a lot of the critique of the book is about responsibility. I had this friend in our business school at Jindal University who uses all these 3 I's and 4 M's and 6 D's and whatnot, which is very popular. Interestingly, Mao also, in Mao's China, they used to have these, phrases. So then I said I should come up with something of my own that will stand it apart, give it a kind of a branding. And so I came up with 3 R's. And 3 R's, simplistically put, regulation. We do need regulation. In this country, we have excess regulation. I know some of the panelists are going to argue that in some sectors. But globally seen, the role of the state has come back in many ways. It's like the wheel going full circle, and I have documented it at great length in the book about how what Anatol Kaletsky calls capitalism 4.0 requires the state to play a far more responsible and central role than it was allowed to by the neoliberal brigades of the 80s and the 90s. And so, regulation, responsibility, I was arguing that the state cannot forego its responsibility to citizens and to also to fellow states. Because one of the sections of the book is about the concept of global governance and about how many states are unable to make concessions or commitments at the multilateral level in order to achieve collective outcomes. Especially since the crisis began, we have a reversion to economic nationalism and protectionism that's hurt the collective cause of recovery from this big shocking crisis that has scalped millions of lives and has affected them in more ways than you normally acknowledge when we have wars. So 9/15 and 9/11, if you think about it, 9/15 is far more devastating than 9/11 was. And that's the reason why I wrote this book. So again, coming back to the 3 R's, radicalism, my argument was that we do need more mass movements, especially for economic justice. And unless the pressure from below is there, you cannot, quote unquote, responsibilize the state. And the only way, and I don't think monetary and fiscal policy can solve the problem or the crisis. My argument has always been as a political scientist that, the Krugmans and the Stiglitzes of the world do have points, important points on the left of the spectrum. But then, if you are not able to energize mass movements and take some value out of them, people will be very dismissive of Occupy Wall Street and of Indignados and of many other mass movements around the world. But my argument is that they all add up incoherently to this new momentum where the state is back, where the onus is on the state in many ways to mediate this clash of interests, as I put it, between investors and the people. So the book is in front of you, and I leave you to judge it. But it's really, I think, for me, it's a privilege that Dr. Tharoor is inaugurating it. He's my boyhood idol, always will be. I think we have come out of his shadow, but we also remain in it in a positive sense, where we continue to take inspiration from all that he does. I don't know how he writes so much. I mean, some of the preceding speakers mentioned that I write, but he continues to churn out volumes despite his hectic life in politics. So I think he's really truly an intellectual in the political sphere, and that makes him one of his kind. So again, I just want to thank him profusely for chairing and for inaugurating my book. Professor Rajkumar is here. I'm going to do a more elaborate round of thanks later. But essentially, this crisis is still with us. That's my point. I want to share it with all of you. And that's why I have written this. We are not out of the woods. We are nowhere close. If you're following what's going on, There's no sustained recovery whatsoever. There's no return to status quo ante either. So what is the future? I have speculated a bit about it. I have opposed the organized left in this book, although I would clearly say that it's a left of center book. I have opposed the communist parties and the socialist parties who have also in many ways not lived up to the expectations of their constituencies, in Europe especially and elsewhere. So we do need a new kind of progressive politics, and that is my humble submission. Thank you very much.